Hey guys, buckle up. Tonight, we're diving headfirst into the opulent, ridiculous, and occasionally downright filthy bedrooms of medieval royalty. Get ready for a wild ride where power, lust, and a complete lack of personal boundaries crash and burn in spectacular fashion. Before you settle in, please take a second to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely dig what I do around here. Also, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you. I always find it so cool to see who's joining the party from across the globe. Now, kill the lights, maybe put on a fan for a little background noise, and let's ease on into tonight's escapade together. King John of England, also known as John Lackland and unofficially history's worst dinner guest, is mostly remembered for signing the Magna Carta, losing half of France, and still somehow managing to be wildly inappropriate with just about every noble family's daughters. John's reign, from 1199 to 1216, was basically a masterclass in how not to behave when you're in a position of public trust. Politically, he was a train wreck. Personally, somehow even worse. John didn't just have lovers, he took them. He was infamous for kidnapping women from noble families, throwing them in royal castles, and keeping them entertained until they were either married off to someone else or conveniently forgotten about. His go-to strategy for breaking up powerful families wasn't military might. Nope, it was seducing the wife, turning her against the husband, and then hitting him with double the taxes. Talk about efficient. Chroniclers were so scandalized by John's antics that even the biased medieval scribes, people who routinely shrugged off witch trials and public floggings, wrote things like, "He was not temperate with women, and he did not abstain from wives and daughters." Louis XV of France, known as Louis the Beloved, ruled from 1715 to 1774, and by ruled, we mostly mean he hosted an endless royal afterparty where governance was optional and silk bedsheets were not. He started out promising enough young, handsome, and poised to carry on the legacy of his great-grandfather, Louis XIV. But somewhere around his 20s, Louis decided national policy could wait because he had a long list of ladies-in-waiting to, shall we say, attend to. Let's talk about the Parc aux Cerfs, the quiet little house near Versailles that Louis used for. Let's call them private additions. Girls were recruited, usually poor but pretty, brought in discreetly, and rotated like seasonal produce. There were so many mistresses, the palace guards likely had a clipboard system. His most famous mistress, Madame de Pompadour, wasn't just a pretty face. She essentially ran France from behind the curtain. But when she stopped wanting to be intimate, Louis was like, no problem, and created a second harem. The reasoning was to keep Pompadour around for her brains and witty conversation, and the other ladies for, well, everything else. It was organized chaos at its finest. Each girl got presents, titles, and sometimes a private place to live once their contract was up. It was pretty much France's most unofficial yet strangely efficient internship program. And the Queen, Marie Leczinska? She was around somewhere, mostly ignored. Once she stopped having babies, Louis treated her like a piece of antique furniture. Too expensive to get rid of, but no longer relevant to the room's decor. The scandals at court were so common that nobles didn't ask if the king had a mistress. They asked how many he had that week. Even foreign ambassadors were gossiping in their letters about the crazy turnover rate at Versailles. That's not a monarchy. That's a brothel with better outfits. Every single piece of Notre Dame was imbued with profound meaning. The imposing columns weren't just mere supports. They represented revered saints. The graceful archways weren't simply decorative embellishments. They were sacred passageways to eternal salvation. The stone itself was a form of theology, and the stonemasons were its patient and dedicated scribes. Meanwhile, outside the towering walls, Paris itself was undergoing a dramatic transformation. The majestic cathedral became its very heartbeat. Bustling markets clustered around it like satellites. Stirring sermons echoed across the winding Seine River. Students from the burgeoning University of Paris gathered in its immense shadow. Notre Dame wasn't just a building. It was steadily becoming the very soul of the rapidly growing city. Yet progress remained stubbornly slow. There were no modern cranes, no noisy power tools, just raw muscle power, rudimentary wooden scaffolding, and an endless reservoir of human resolve. Hundreds of dedicated workers toiled tirelessly year after year. When one tragically died, another stepped up to immediately take his place. The individual names of these workers were rarely recorded for posterity. Their primary reward wasn't earthly fame, but unwavering faith. They built not for themselves or for immediate recognition, but for God and for generations yet unborn. By the year 1200, the choir and much of the nave were already standing tall and proud. The unmistakable outlines of a genuine miracle were slowly taking shape. Notre Dame was no longer just a hopeful dream. It was now solid stone and sparkling glass, human sweat and fervent prayer. And just as the impressive structure reached skyward, so too did the soaring ambitions of its dedicated builders. Because what they planned to create next would truly defy gravity and reason. Notre Dame was already unlike anything the city had ever witnessed before, but it was also undeniably ambitious, perhaps even dangerously so. It steadily became the beating heart of the state religion, regularly hosting elaborate coronations, lavish royal weddings, and solemn state funerals. When kings and queens married, they did so beneath its soaring vaulted ceilings. When wars were declared or hard-fought victories were finally celebrated, the thunderous bells of Notre Dame rang loud and clear across the swirling waters of the Seine River. Monarchs entered as mere rulers of the land and confidently exited as the chosen representatives of God himself. But it wasn't only powerful kings and queens who passed through those towering great doors. Generals, powerful bishops, and visiting foreign dignitaries came to solemnly kneel or to subtly negotiate. And when disaster inevitably struck, terrible famines, devastating plagues, brutal invasions, the Parisians reliably filled the towering nave with heartfelt prayers and solemn processions, desperately pleading for divine intervention. The magnificent cathedral became a constant sanctuary of both fervent hope and abject fear, always carefully watching, always patiently waiting. Politically, Notre Dame became the solid spiritual anchor of the influential French monarchy. Its perfectly central location on the Isle de la Cite, at the literal and symbolic heart of the vibrant city of Paris, made it the undeniably perfect backdrop for the performance of ritualized power. Priests often blessed the battle banners before the army marched off to war. The French crown was inextricably linked not only to royal bloodlines but also to a perceived divine mandate. If the king unquestionably ruled France, then Notre Dame arguably ruled his very soul. Culturally, it steadily remained a prominent center of widespread awe. Pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles just to catch a glimpse of its sacred relics, including the legendary crown of thorns, widely believed to have been worn by Christ himself during his agonizing crucifixion. By 1810, Qing she had accomplished the seemingly impossible. She had held off the might of the Qing dynasty, humiliated foreign navies, and ruled the waves with unmatched dominance. But she was also a realist, and she understood that wars, especially those with endless fronts and a growing number of enemies, couldn't be fought indefinitely. Her supplies were dwindling, her alliances were strained, and her fleet, though still massive, was beginning to feel the weight of attrition. So, she decided to change her tactics and pursue a different strategy. She reached out to the Qing government, not with a plea for surrender, but with a set of carefully considered terms, bold terms that reflected her position of strength. She knew that she held significant leverage over them. The Qing had repeatedly failed to defeat her militarily. Their own citizens feared her more than they respected the empire's authority. She could therefore bargain with them not as a common criminal begging for mercy, but as the leader of a powerful state negotiating with another sovereign power. She traveled to Guangzhou in person on her own ship, surrounded by heavily armed guards and proudly flying the colors of the Red Flag Fleet. It wasn't a gesture of supplication. It was a calculated power move designed to intimidate and impress. She requested amnesty, not just for herself, but for her entire fleet, which numbered in the thousands of pirates. She demanded the right to keep all of her accumulated wealth. She even insisted that her second-in-command and husband, Cheng Putsai, be granted a military rank in the Qing Navy. The government officials were stunned by her audacity, but the truth was that they were exhausted, too. The empire simply couldn't afford to finance another costly and drawn-out military campaign. So, in a moment of rare pragmatism, they agreed to her terms. She surrendered in style, leaving no doubt as to who held the upper hand. Which, in medieval terms, basically means he totally ruined the office Christmas party. At one point, John reportedly had 30 mistresses on the official record. That's not romantic. That's a human resources nightmare. Several nobles complained directly to the crown that John was taking advantage of their hospitality, which is a very polite way of saying he was sleeping with everyone, including the serving staff and possibly even the family goat. His behavior was so off the rails that it almost sparked a rebellion, and not over taxes or war, but because half the barons were terrified to leave their wives alone during royal visits. One baron straight up refused to meet with John unless his entire household was locked down first. Now that's diplomacy 13th century style. And yet, in true royal fashion, John never seemed to think he was doing anything wrong. He genuinely believed he was irresistible. There's zero evidence to support this belief outside of his own letters, but hey, when you're the king, delusion is basically a perk of the job. In the end, King John left behind a kingdom in chaos, a legacy of deep distrust, and probably a bunch of kids no one at court ever talked about. He was the kind of king who made people invent democracy just to keep him away from their families. Not the absolute worst monarch in history, but definitely the one you'd never let babysit. Charles VI of France, also known as Charles the Mad, ruled from 1380 to 1422. And trust me, he earned that nickname. It wasn't just handed out at some drunken banquet. He started his reign with such promise, young, good-looking, and seemingly capable. But then, things took a major left turn. He started forgetting who he was, attacking his own knights, and at one point, became convinced he was made of glass, demanding his servants wrap him in blankets so he wouldn't shatter when he walked. Not exactly the picture of kingly strength, but you have to give him points for creative paranoia. The funny thing is, Louis really thought he was a good ruler, what with all the lavish parties, secret pregnancies, and awkward dinners with his wife. While his time as king wasn't a complete disaster, it definitely set the stage for his grandson, Louis XVI, who would eventually lose his head, probably because Grandpa spent too much time thinking with the wrong head. In the end, Louis XV left behind a France swimming in debt, a court that was totally over it, and a royal reputation that could best be summed up as loved by women, hated by accountants. Christian VII of Denmark ruled from 1766 to 1808. Though ruled might be a bit of an exaggeration. He sort of stumbled through life while other people actually ran the country. You see, Christian had some, shall we say, issues. He had a severe mental illness, probably schizophrenia, and wasn't really into the whole king thing, unless it involved chasing servants with silverware, which he thought was hilarious. This made him more of a royal mascot than a monarch. Now, Christian had a wife, Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, a reasonable young woman who expected a somewhat normal marriage. What she got was a husband who preferred to take care of things himself in public, talk to his hand, and disappear during fancy dinners to pretend he was riding horses through the palace hallways. It's hard to say what gave out first, her patience or his grip on reality. Then came Johann Friedrich Struensee, the king's doctor. Smart, ambitious, and very interested in power, Struensee quickly became the real ruler of Denmark. And, in an awkward turn of events, the queen's lover. Yep, Caroline Matilda went full soap opera and had an affair with her husband's physician. And the king didn't even notice or care. Struensee wrote the laws, signed the official papers, and kept Christian busy with puppet shows, sword fights, and gently steered him away from pointy objects. As the massive walls rose ever higher and the vaulted ceilings expanded to fill the vast space, a potentially disastrous problem began to emerge: sheer weight. The heavy stone ceilings pressed stubbornly outward, not just directly downward. The higher the towering vaults climbed, the more they relentlessly threatened to push the supporting walls completely apart. Traditional Romanesque-style churches had cleverly solved this problem with incredibly thick walls and tiny, strategically placed windows. But Notre Dame was brilliantly designed to breathe with light, to glow with divine radiance, to reach the very heavens in both spirit and physical space. That's when the incredibly skilled masons did something truly revolutionary. They embraced a bold architectural idea, one that was barely tested at the time, and ran with it. The flying buttress. These weren't just mere supports. They were ingenious external arms crafted from stone, elegantly arching from the upper walls down to solid piers that stood apart from the main building. Like skeletal wings, they effectively braced the massive cathedral from the outside, cleverly transferring the relentless outward force of the heavy ceiling down into the stable ground, where it could no longer cause significant structural damage. From the ground, they looked impossibly delicate, like intricate lace meticulously made from limestone. But they were actually an incredible feat of pure engineering genius, and they allowed Notre Dame to become precisely what it was always meant to be: a magnificent structure of air, light, and seemingly impossible height. The innovative use of flying buttresses dramatically changed everything. With the constant pressure relieved from the interior walls, the builders could confidently add even more impressive windows. Its impressive great organ thundered magnificently during religious feast days. Its skilled choirs echoed with impressively polyphonic music that constantly pushed the well-established boundaries of medieval composition. Notre Dame was certainly never static. It constantly evolved over time, steadily absorbing new artistic styles, innovative musical traditions, and subtle liturgical forms. But by the 17th and 18th centuries, its distinctive Gothic beauty began to noticeably fall out of favor. Baroque architecture was all the current rage, and Notre Dame, dark, spiky, and decidedly medieval in appearance, was increasingly seen as hopelessly outdated. Some ill-advised renovations were even attempted in a clumsy effort to somehow modernize its unique look, foolishly smoothing over what had once been daring and innovative. Still, it stubbornly stood, a magnificent cathedral caught awkwardly between centuries, still revered by many yet increasingly overlooked by a growing number of Parisian citizens. Its towering spires weathered both destructive storms and the relentless passage of time. Its majestic bells still loudly tolled, but something fundamental was slowly shifting beneath its carefully laid foundations. Notre Dame had been magnificently born from unwavering faith and crowned by powerful kings. But it would soon face a terrifying force that even solid stone couldn't possibly ignore: revolution. When the bloody French Revolution brutally erupted in 1789, Notre Dame de Paris tragically found itself on the distinctly wrong side of rapidly changing history. For centuries, it had proudly stood as a towering monument to the monarchy and to organized religion, two of the very institutions that the violent revolution sought to completely erase from the face of France. Suddenly, the imposing cathedral that had once crowned powerful kings and queens became a hated symbol of oppression, and powerful symbols during revolutions rarely survive completely untouched. On April 18, 1810, she led over 17,000 pirates, including men, women, and children, into the city, not in chains as defeated prisoners, but in a grand procession that showcased their power and resilience. Over 200 ships were handed over to the Qing Navy, weapons were laid down ceremonially, and the entire pirate confederation was formally disbanded without a single drop of blood being shed. There were no trials, no executions, and no forfeiture of wealth. Chung Patsai was granted a captaincy in the Qing Navy, as she had requested. And Qing she retired as a free woman, untouched, undefeated, and still immensely wealthy. In a world where most pirate stories end in betrayal, capture, or death, Qing Shi's story ended with successful negotiation and a comfortable retirement. She had played the game perfectly, first with cannons and cutlasses, then with carefully chosen words. And as her red banners were lowered for the final time, her legend was only just beginning to rise. Most pirate tales conclude with bloodshed, the gallows, or a descent into obscurity. But Qing Shi not only avoided that fate, she built an entirely new life from the ashes of her pirate career. After negotiating the most successful pirate surrender in history, she walked away not as a fugitive on the run, but as a respected and wealthy woman, her legacy firmly intact. In 1810, after the formal surrender of her fleet, she settled in Canton, which is now known as Guangzhou, with her husband, Chung Patsai, who served as a captain in the Qing Navy. The transition from notorious pirate queen to respectable citizen might seem absurd on the surface, but for Qing Shi, it was simply another calculated act of survival, a pragmatic adaptation to changing circumstances. She lived openly and comfortably, and the Qing authorities largely left her alone, recognizing the potential trouble she could cause if they were to cross her. Now, most kings who think they're delicate glass figurines tend to steer clear of scandal. Not Charles. He somehow managed to juggle a royal mistress, a full-blown paranoid delusion, and a civil war all at the same time. Talk about multitasking. His long-suffering wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, tried her best to manage the court while Charles was busy doing things like running screaming from mirrors and refusing to bathe because he was afraid the water might dissolve him. Meanwhile, his mistress, Odette de Champdivers, was quietly moved into the palace and introduced to everyone as his comfort, which was medieval code for, don't ask questions, just smile and nod. Odette, for her part, stuck with Charles through his most unhinged years. She must have had the patience of a saint or a seriously ironclad property agreement. She reportedly brushed his hair, listened to his glass-related rants, and helped him put on layer after layer of padded clothing so he could sit down without breaking. Nothing says true love like strapping your royal boyfriend into a pillow suit. But Charles's eccentricities weren't just happening behind closed doors. He also threw court entertainments where things went spectacularly wrong. During one infamous event known as the Bal d'Ardence, he and his buddies dressed up as wild men in highly flammable costumes and danced around with torches. Of course, someone dropped a torch and several of them went up in flames. Charles survived, but his dignity definitely didn't. Despite all of this, Charles managed to father 12 children, several of them during periods of apparent lucidity, or at least enough lucidity. Royal chronicles don't specify whether he remembered their names, but you can bet that naming a kid not made of glass was probably frowned upon. Charles VI basically ran France into the ground. But even more impressively, he managed to combine mental illness, royal scandal, and medieval pyrotechnics into one tragicomic package. It was probably the only love triangle in history where one of the parties was just humming to himself in the background. Caroline and Struensee even had a kid together, technically the king's, but definitely not in reality. For a while, they ran Denmark like a really progressive, slightly scandalous think tank. But royal courts aren't usually very laid back. Eventually, Christian's jealous mother-in-law found out about the affair and staged a coup. Struensee was arrested, tortured, and executed in a very dramatic way, and Caroline was shipped off to exile with her reputation ruined. As for Christian, he went back to being a gently supervised liability, spending the rest of his reign in a quiet, padded existence. His reign isn't remembered for accomplishments, but for how completely absurd it all was. A king who didn't rule, a queen who tried her best, and a doctor who tried a little too hard. History calls it a constitutional crisis. We call it Europe's weirdest love story. Charles II of England, who ruled from 1660 to 1685, came back from being exiled with one main goal: bring back the fun, preferably with as many mistresses as humanly possible. Spoiler alert, mission accomplished. After surviving a civil war, hiding in oak trees, and living in poverty on the continent, Charles came back to England as king and immediately decided that the country needed less Puritanism and more clothing-optional ballroom dancing. Parliament reluctantly agreed. Nicknamed the Merry Monarch, Charles had dozens of official mistresses, and that's just the ones we know about. His most famous squeeze was Nell Gwyn, a sharp-tongued actress who once called herself the Protestant WH**E, just to stand out from the other mistresses. Honestly, that's iconic branding right there. Then there was Barbara Palmer, titled Countess of Castlemaine, who was less of a mistress and more of a permanent fixture at the palace. The great rose windows, vast wheels of vibrantly stained glass depicting revered saints, graceful angels, and apocalyptic visions, were no longer just a fanciful dream. They were rapidly becoming a breathtaking reality. Radiant color exploded into the sacred space, filling it with divine light. And God's timeless stories now came not just from the priest's pulpit, but directly from the sun's life-giving rays. Ironically, the original construction plans for Notre Dame had never even included flying buttresses. Early Gothic builders simply hadn't yet fully grasped their full potential. But as the structure grew taller and more complex, so did the structural strain on the walls. The skilled masons skillfully adapted on the fly, quite literally. They began adding these ingenious stone wings in the early 1200s, turning potential necessity into enduring poetry. Critics at the time were deeply divided. Some thought the exposed supports were rather unsightly, interrupting the otherwise clean silhouette of the impressive building. But most stood in complete awe, gazing upward with mouths agape. Notre Dame looked almost as though it was being carefully held in place by airborne stone angels caught in graceful mid-flight. The magnificent cathedral was no longer just a simple house of God. It was a living demonstration of what both deep faith and applied mathematics could build together in perfect harmony. A timeless hymn artfully carved in gravity-defying limestone, and its awe-inspiring wings had only just begun to spread. By the early 1200s, Notre Dame had already transformed the entire Parisian skyline, but its most iconic features were still very much in the process of taking shape. As the cathedral's eastern end steadily neared completion, the focus gradually shifted westward. What rose there would ultimately become the instantly recognizable face of the cathedral, the part that most people would immediately recognize. The brutal attack was both coldly ideological and intensely physical. Revolutionaries violently stormed into the ancient cathedral. Statues of the biblical kings that prominently adorned the facade were mistakenly identified as French monarchs, and all 28 of them were barbarically beheaded with axes and hammers. Priceless sculptures were maliciously smashed into countless pieces. The sacred altars were viciously desecrated. The great bells that had once loudly tolled for royal births and somber papal visits were unceremoniously torn down and immediately melted into cannon metal. Precious religious relics, including the legendary crown of thorns, were hastily removed and hidden away. Many were tragically lost forever. What ultimately remained was a desecrated and hollowed shell of its former glorious self. Notre Dame was officially deconsecrated. In 1793, it ceased to be a church. Instead, it was transformed into what they called the Temple of Reason, a space for revolutionary festivals that celebrated secular enlightenment. At one point, it even functioned as a warehouse used for storing wine. The soaring nave, which had once reverberated with hymns, now reeked of spilled wine and damp stone. The spire, damaged and decaying, was eventually taken down for safety reasons. Gargoyles tumbled from their high perches. The roof leaked constantly. Rats scurried through the crypt. It seemed as if Paris had lost its heart, replaced by a forgotten ruin at its very center. And yet, amazingly, it survived. When Napoleon rose to power, he understood the symbolic importance of Notre Dame Cathedral. In 1804, he selected it as the location for his self-coronation as emperor. The cathedral was hastily reconsecrated and cleaned up just enough to accommodate the extravagant ceremony. But this wasn't a truly religious act. It was pure theater. Napoleon famously crowned himself, grabbing the crown right out of the Pope's hands. Rather than fading into obscurity, she quietly transformed herself into a successful businesswoman. She opened a gambling house and ran an opium smuggling operation, both technically illegal, but largely overlooked by the authorities due to her continued influence and connections. She wasn't trying to build another empire, but she certainly had no intention of being forgotten or marginalized. She maintained her existing connections, carefully protected her considerable wealth, and continued to live life on her own terms. Her marriage to Chung Putzai endured, and together they raised a family. While he continued to serve in the Qing Navy, ironically hunting down pirates who were quite similar to their former selves, she focused on managing and expanding their various business interests. She moved in elite social circles, was consulted on maritime affairs by government officials, and remained a legendary figure among sailors and traders all along the South China coast. What makes her story truly extraordinary isn't just that she survived, but how she lived her life both before and after her time as a pirate. She shattered every mold that her society had created for women. Born into poverty and sold into prostitution, she clawed her way to the top of a male-dominated criminal underworld. Then, instead of dying in battle or on the scaffold as so many other pirates did, she retired peacefully and died of old age in 1844 at the age of 69. She didn't seek redemption for her past actions. She didn't feel that she needed it. Her entire life was an ultimate act of defiance, a living refutation of every law, custom, and expectation that had been placed before her. In a time when women were barely allowed to speak in public, she commanded fleets, dictated treaties, and negotiated with emperors. And then she walked away richer and freer than any pirate in history. And somehow they still let him wear the crown. Peter the Cruel, also known as Pedro the Just, depending on whether you were on his side or hiding from him under a floorboard, ruled Castile from 1350 to 1369. His idea of romance was a bizarre mix of royal charm, obsessive jealousy, and the occasional politically motivated murder. His early love life wasn't exactly straight out of Shakespeare. He fell hard for a noblewoman named Maria de Padilla, whom he may or may not have secretly married. The secretly part is important, mostly because he was also being married off to other women for political alliances, which made things a tad awkward. One of those women was Blanche of Bourbon, a French noblewoman whom he married and then locked in a castle 3 days later. She spent the rest of her life imprisoned because Peter decided Maria had prettier hair. Or maybe he just didn't like Blanche's accent. Either way, it was a seriously aggressive form of ghosting. Maria, meanwhile, became his lifelong obsession. Even when he married other women, she was always his favorite. When she died, Peter reportedly wept for days and then declared her his legal wife retroactively, just to confuse everyone and possibly to justify the fact that she'd already given birth to 4 of his kids. But Peter's passions didn't stop at surprise annulments and royal kidnappings. He was known for falling in love violently, which isn't romantic, it's just dangerous. One of his mistresses, Dona Juana, tried to leave him. She was later found in pieces, as were several of his political enemies, cousins, and the occasional person who made eye contact at the wrong moment. Contemporary accounts mention that Peter sometimes watched executions from his balcony while lounging around with a mistress. That's not charming sociopath. That's HBO villain with serious impulse control issues. But even with all the drama, the Castilian court was never dull. She lived openly in the royal apartments and had several children with Charles, all of whom were given titles and land because nepotism is way more fun when it's flirty. Charles didn't even try to hide anything. He brought his mistresses to court events. He paid them government pensions. He even had a hallway built at Whitehall so they could get to his bedroom without bothering the ambassadors. Now that's efficiency. Queen Catherine of Braganza, his long-suffering wife, put up with it all with quiet dignity and probably a flask or 2. She didn't have any children, and Charles supposedly said, "She couldn't give me children, but she never gave me trouble," which is both a compliment and a total red flag. Charles fathered at least 14 illegitimate children and recognized most of them, giving them fancy titles and throwing them elaborate birthday parties. Meanwhile, the legitimate line remained childless, as if karma had a sense of humor. Despite the scandals, Charles was actually pretty popular. He reopened theaters, made fun legal again, and brought back the monarchy with style, wigs, and more eyeliner than his actresses wore. The people forgave him everything, mostly because he made being king look like a party. When he died, his last words were, "Let not poor Nelly starve. Not God bless England. Not tell my brother to rule wisely. Just feed the mistress." And that, my friends, sums up Charles II, a king who ruled like he was hosting the royal version of The Bachelor season finale. Eric XIV of Sweden ruled from 1560 to 1568. It was a short reign, but long enough to leave behind a legacy of paranoia, poetry, and unbelievably bad dating choices. Eric started out promising. Tall, handsome, into astronomy and the arts, the kind of king who might write you a love poem and then explain planetary orbits over dinner. He was also obsessed with astrology, so he almost never made decisions without checking the stars first. The soaring twin towers and the monumental west facade. This facade wasn't just a simple entrance. It was a powerful statement, spiritual, architectural, and even political in nature. The Catholic Church intentionally wanted you to feel small and insignificant as you approached it, and it definitely succeeded in that lofty goal. The imposing doors soared to seemingly impossible heights. Above them, rows of intricately sculpted kings, prophets, saints, and even demons carefully watched every single visitor who dared to approach. You weren't simply entering a building. You were deliberately walking into sacred judgment. Construction began on the impressive West Towers sometime around the 1220s. Like everything else at Notre Dame, they took decades of tireless effort to complete. Each tower steadily rose in stages, block by painstaking block, gradually reaching an impressive height of nearly 70 meters. And yet, they were never truly completed precisely as originally planned. No soaring spires, no sharp needlepoints, just massive flat-topped silhouettes, majestic in their unique simplicity. Between the two towers sat the Gallery of Kings, featuring 28 individual statues representing the ancient monarchs of Judah. Tragically, they were completely misunderstood during the tumultuous French Revolution as actual French kings and were therefore brutally decapitated by angry mobs. But during the 13th century, they sent a very clear and powerful message: divine right, heavenly order, sacred rule. The Catholic Church and the French crown walked hand in hand in lockstep, and this towering facade was their unmistakable front porch. Below them, the three great portals served as a form of theological storytelling ingeniously carved in stone. The central one, known as the Portal of the Last Judgment, was adorned with Christ seated in all his heavenly glory, flanked by both angels and demons, and resurrected souls rising slowly from their long-forgotten graves. Notre Dame once again served the powerful, but it lacked the sanctity it had once embodied. Still, the decades of neglect had left lasting scars. By the 1830s, Notre Dame was falling apart both physically and spiritually. There were even plans to tear it down more than once. Some Parisians believed it would be better to replace it with something modern, something less medieval and less haunting. But then a writer intervened. A writer who could see beyond the cracked stones and broken statues to something timeless, something worth preserving. Because just when the world was on the verge of forgetting Notre Dame, Victor Hugo reminded everyone. In 1831, a book was published that would ultimately save a cathedral. Victor Hugo's Notre Dame de Paris, later known in English as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, was more than just a Gothic novel. It was a passionate argument for preservation. Through the eyes of Quasimodo, the deformed bell ringer, Hugo transformed Notre Dame into more than just a setting. It became a living, breathing character, wounded, misunderstood, beautiful in its decay, and the public listened intently. The novel stirred emotions throughout France. Suddenly, Parisians realized what they were about to lose. Notre Dame wasn't just old. It was a masterpiece, a monument to centuries of devotion and craftsmanship. The public outcry worked. By 1844, King Louis Philippe approved a full-scale restoration of the cathedral. Two architects, Eugene Viollet-le-Duc and Jean-Baptiste Lassus, spearheaded the project. Their goal was not simply to repair the damage, but to restore the very soul of the cathedral. They replaced the eroded statues, rebuilt the Gallery of Kings, and reimagined the spire that had been removed during the Revolution. This new spire, designed by Viollet-le-Duc, would rise 315 feet above the ground, taller and more ornate than the original. It would quickly become one of the most iconic silhouettes in all of Europe. Her sails were lowered, her cannons were silenced, yet her legend continued to echo across the sea, inspiring both fear and admiration. History remembers the names of pirates like Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, and Henry Morgan, men who roamed the Caribbean, wreaked havoc, and met violent ends. But standing in the shadow of their infamous reputations is Qing Shi, not only as their equal but as someone who surpassed them by almost every conceivable measure. She didn't merely captain a handful of ships. She commanded entire fleets. She didn't simply plunder a few coastal towns. She controlled entire regions of the sea. And she didn't die on the gallows or in a bloody gunfight. She negotiated her way out of piracy and into a life of peace and prosperity. Among the pantheon of pirate legends, she remains the most successful and yet the least understood. But make no mistake, her success wasn't simply a matter of luck or ruthlessness. It was the product of careful strategy, sharp intellect, and a deep understanding of the dynamics of power. She was a skilled tactician, a shrewd politician, and a gifted psychologist. She knew how to inspire loyalty through fear, yes, but also through order, reward, and a carefully crafted system of rules and regulations. And what made her truly exceptional was the fact that she achieved all of this as a woman in Qing-era China, a society steeped in Confucian ideals that rigidly confined women to silence and servitude. Women were not expected to lead in the marketplace, much less on the high seas. Qing, she didn't just challenge that norm. She utterly shattered it into a million pieces. She earned the respect of hardened pirate captains, forced the Qing dynasty to the negotiating table as an equal, and ended her life as a wealthy business owner and respected matriarch. She wasn't dependent on a man's legacy to define her. She took control of it, expanded it, and made it entirely her own. Gossip spread faster than wine, and Peter's relationships blurred the line between passion and outright vendetta. His idea of romantic gestures included surprise weddings, surprise divorces, and the occasional surprise stabbing. Eventually, Peter was killed by his own half-brother in a rather symbolic act of family therapy. But his reputation as one of Europe's most aggressively unromantic romantics lives on. If love is a battlefield, Peter showed up with siege equipment. Edward II of England ruled from 1307 to 1327 and is best remembered for two things: losing to the Scots at Bannockburn and showing way more affection to his male favorites than to his actual queen. One of those things was considered treason. The other was just considered controversial dinner conversation. Let's start with Piers Gaveston, Edward's childhood buddy, rumored lover, and full-time fashion icon. Piers wasn't just close to Edward. He was promoted to positions of ridiculous influence, given estates, titles, and jewelry that frankly clashed with every single one of his outfits. At Edward's coronation, Piers wore more bling than the royal regalia and totally upstaged the queen, which is a bold move when your survival depends on nobles not hating you. Spoiler alert, they hated him. Edward's wife, Isabella of France, was understandably furious. She came with political expectations and a fat dowry, neither of which included sharing the throne with her husband's best friend / possible boyfriend. Edward, however, remained devoted. When the nobles demanded Piers be exiled, Edward sulked, sent him away, and then brought him right back. Think teenage breakup, but with castles and crossbows. Eventually, the barons had enough and executed Piers. Edward was devastated. Think full-on royal meltdown. Mourning clothes, public weeping, the whole medieval soap opera. His grief, however, didn't lead to any kind of self-reflection. It just made room for a new favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Unfortunately, the stars never told him to chill out. Eric was into noble women, but not in a subtle whispering in the garden kind of way. He proposed to Queen Elizabeth I of England multiple times, and she repeatedly turned him down. Politely at first, then firmly, then with complete silence. Eric didn't get the hint and even sent her portraits of himself as gifts, which is basically the 16th century equivalent of sliding into someone's DMs with a shirtless selfie and a marriage contract. After Elizabeth ghosted him, Eric lowered his sights in rank, but not in enthusiasm. He fell for Karen Mansdaughter, a commoner and the daughter of a jailer. This shocked the nobles, which just made Eric even more determined. He married her, crowned her queen, and then spent the next year having emotional breakdowns, imprisoning nobles, and stabbing people he thought were giving her funny looks. His most infamous moment was the Stour murders, a casual dinner party that ended with Eric personally killing a noble with a knife while shouting things that made his courtiers wonder if astrology had finally broken his brain. By that point, he was hearing voices, hiding from invisible enemies, and sometimes dressing up in disguise to spy on his own council. The nobles staged an intervention, which in royal terms means they locked him in a castle and gave the crown to his brother. Eric spent the rest of his life in prison, writing weird love poetry to Karen, ranting about conspiracies every now and then, and probably regretting stabbing that guy during supper. Sweden learned a few things from Eric's reign. Always check your dinner guests for hidden blades. Avoid kings who write their own horoscopes. And maybe, just maybe, don't crown the guy who insists the moon is whispering about betrayal. To the generally illiterate masses, these vividly depicted scenes weren't just mere decoration. They were powerful doctrine. The implicit message was undeniably clear. Enter these hallowed halls with due reverence. Eternity starts right here. Above the doors, a stunning rose window elegantly bloomed into being, measuring nearly 10 meters across and framed by intricate tracery and flanked by impressive statues of the Virgin Mary and her child. Light passed effortlessly through the vibrantly colored glass like a divine spotlight, projecting reverent saints across the entire nave. By the mid-1200s, the soaring towers were nearly complete. The entire west facade stood proudly in its complete form, solemn, symmetrical, and utterly overwhelming. It was an imposing fortress of deeply held faith, a massive billboard boldly proclaiming God's absolute authority, and a stark warning to any potential sinner. And yet, the dedicated builders weren't quite done. The very heart of Notre Dame still needed its finishing touches. The transept, the towering roof, the elegant spire that would one day pierce the very clouds above. They had painstakingly built its impressive face. Now they would give it a worthy crown, with the iconic towers and the west facade standing in proud defiance of gravity. Notre Dame was steadily becoming far more than just an empty shell. It needed a soul, and that intangible soul lived inside within the vast expanse of its magnificent nave, its sweeping transepts, and its sacred choir. These were the hallowed spaces that would carry the harmonious voices of countless monks, the solemn footsteps of powerful kings, and the heartfelt prayers of thousands upon thousands of faithful worshippers. By the mid-1200s, work had shifted to primarily focus on the transepts, the essential arms of the iconic cross-shaped layout that gave Gothic cathedrals their instantly recognizable floor plan. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, Notre Dame returned to its rightful place as the spiritual and cultural heart of Paris. It hosted countless masses, witnessed liberation ceremonies, and welcomed millions of visitors from around the world. It even survived 2 world wars. During the Nazi occupation, its bells remained silent. But when Paris was finally liberated in 1944, they rang out in triumph. Sadly, tragedy would strike again. On April 15, 2019, a fire broke out beneath the roof. Within minutes, flames engulfed the wooden framework known as the forest, some beams of which dated back to the 13th century. The fire raged for hours. The roof collapsed. The 19th century spire fell in a plume of smoke. The world watched in horror as one of humanity's greatest monuments seemed to vanish before their very eyes. And yet, once again, it survived. The stone towers stood firm. The rose windows endured, and the sacred relics were saved. The people of France, along with the rest of the world, pledged to rebuild it. Notre Dame has always been more than just architecture. It is a symbol of memory, identity, resilience, faith, and survival. And in every stone that rises from its ashes, it reminds us that faith and beauty can be reborn, even in the face of devastation. She was born in 1775 in the Guangdong province of China. Her birth name was never written down. History would simply remember her as Qing Shi, the wife of Zhang Yi. But what she accomplished with that name would shake empires to their core. In her early years, she worked as a prostitute on a Cantonese floating brothel, a common fate for poor girls in 18th century coastal China. These so-called flower boats catered to merchants, naval officers, and, of course, pirates. But she was different from the other women. She listened carefully. She observed everything. She remembered names and faces. She got powerful clients to talk. Over time, she became more than just entertainment. In popular memory, she remained something of a phantom, less famous than her male counterparts, less romanticized in Western literature, and often omitted entirely from mainstream history textbooks. But within maritime circles and in the rich folklore of the Chinese coast, she is spoken of with a mixture of awe, respect, and a healthy dose of fear. The red flag fleet may have vanished from the seas, its sails lowered for good, but the memory of Qing, she lingers like a ghost ship, silent, untouchable, and larger than life. She was not just a pirate, not just a woman, but a legend who made empires kneel before her. And in a world historically ruled by men, she didn't ask for a seat at the table. She seized control of the entire ocean and claimed it as her own. Despite commanding the largest pirate fleet the world has ever seen, Qing, she remains strangely absent from most mainstream history books. Her legacy, though immense, has been obscured, overshadowed by romanticized Western pirate myths, and buried beneath layers of colonial bias, gender prejudice, and political discomfort. Why is this the case? Because her story simply doesn't fit the traditional historical mold. She wasn't a tragic anti-hero like Blackbeard, destined for a violent end. She didn't die in battle, gloriously defending her honor. She wasn't European, fitting neatly into the narrative of Western expansion and exploration. And, perhaps most threatening of all, she was a woman who outplayed an entire empire, exposing its weaknesses and forcing it to negotiate on her terms. That kind of power is disruptive, challenging the neat, male-dominated narratives that historians have long preferred to tell. In official Chinese records, she is often treated more like a problem that was solved than as a significant historical figure worthy of study. The Qing dynasty had no desire to celebrate her accomplishments. They would have much rather erased her from the historical record altogether. Hugh made Piers look like a subtle footnote. He wasn't just Edward's advisor. He was basically the second king. Land, titles, entire counties, Hugh got them. The rest of the nobility? They got angry. Isabella, by this point, had switched from annoyed wife to full-blown vengeance mode. She teamed up with a lover of her own, Edward's enemy, naturally, invaded England and overthrew her husband. Edward was imprisoned, stripped of his crown, and possibly murdered with a red-hot poker. Yes, that rumor exists. No, we're not going to discuss the physics of it. Let's just say medieval revenge was rarely subtle. Edward II's reign was less about governing and more about personal drama so intense it could be its own reality show. If the Plantagenets had Netflix, his season would have been banned in at least 3 countries. His mistake, mixing politics with passion, ignoring everyone else, and assuming that royal power meant nobody could touch him. Turns out, eventually, everyone could. Wenceslas of Bohemia ruled in the late 14th century, though ruled might be a bit of an overstatement. He technically held titles like King of the Romans and King of Bohemia, but his real accomplishments were more along the lines of public nudity, heavy drinking, and starting fights in his own palace. If you're thinking of good King Wenceslas from the Christmas Carol, you've got the wrong guy. That was his ancestor. This Wenceslas, not good, not even vaguely decent. He started out promising. Crowned as a teenager, intelligent, multilingual, and capable. But somewhere along the line, he decided the royal wine cellar was more useful than the treasury and started governing from the bottom of a goblet. Wenceslas developed a reputation for hosting multi-day drinking sessions where policy decisions were made between rounds of mead and inappropriate limericks. His advisors started carrying flasks, not to drink, but to survive negotiations. Ferdinand I of Naples, also known as Ferdinand of Aragon, ruled from the mid-15th century and brought with him a unique combination of charm, brutality, and a hobby that would make most people cancel dinner plans immediately. On the surface, Ferdinand was a sophisticated and efficient ruler. He stabilized his kingdom, balanced the budget, and crushed rebellions quickly. But his leadership style was basically friendly dictator with a side of psychological warfare. Take, for example, how he dealt with enemies. Most kings exiled traitors. Some imprisoned them. Ferdinand? He preferred to stuff them. Yep, human taxidermy. After executing rebellious nobles, he had them embalmed and put on display in a private museum under his castle. It was called the Black Room, and he gave tours to foreign dignitaries, visiting ambassadors, and even potential traitors. Nothing says, behave yourself, like showing someone your haul of preserved political mistakes. He apparently loved describing each corpse by name, crime, and facial expression. Some were posed screaming, others had plaques. One guest actually fainted. Ferdinand thought it was hilarious. If TripAdvisor had existed back then, the reviews would have been 5 stars, deeply unsettling, would not return without a sedative. Now, when he wasn't curating the creepiest gallery in Europe, Ferdinand had a pretty questionable romantic life. He fathered a bunch of illegitimate children, many of whom suddenly showed up with titles and land. His official queen was just one of many women in his life, and it's suspected that Ferdinand saw marriage as more of a suggestion than a rule. His mistresses ranged from noble women to peasants, with the only thing they had in common being his complete lack of concern for keeping things discreet. Royal banquets sometimes turned into flirting competitions. One ambassador noticed that Ferdinand never ate dinner without sampling from multiple courses, political and otherwise. Under the guidance of architect Jean de Chelles and later Pierre de Montreal, these prominent wings were skillfully expanded and further adorned with brand new rose windows, even more ornate and impressive than those on the western end. The north transept featured a stunningly luminous window that bathed the sacred space in cool blues and heavenly purples. The south transept was noticeably warmer, fiery, and just as undeniably divine. These weren't merely superficial design choices. They were a potent form of theology expressed in vibrant color. The impressive northern window represented the Old Testament, while the southern one represented the New Testament. Together, the two transept wings told the complete and compelling story of human salvation, one brilliantly illuminated in life-giving light, the other in all-consuming fire. Inside the cathedral, the towering columns soared impressively like ancient tree trunks in a vast forest of stone. The vaulted ceilings stretched nearly 35 meters high, their intricately ribbed arches gracefully meeting like reverent palms joined together in solemn prayer. This wasn't just mere architecture. It was pure choreography, an artful upward motion carefully guiding the very soul towards the infinite heavens above. And then, of course, there was the ornate altar, the sacred center of the entire space. It was here that the Holy Mass was celebrated with deep reverence. It was here that priceless relics were venerated with utmost respect. And it was here that the elite of France came to humbly kneel in supplication. Royal weddings, solemn coronation masses, official papal visits. Notre Dame became the very spiritual stage for the entire nation itself. But it wasn't only the wealthy elite who filled these hallowed walls. The ordinary people came as well. Humble merchants, weary peasants, devout pilgrims. She became an information broker, gathering valuable intelligence. Then came Zhang Yi, a powerful pirate lord who commanded the Red Flag Fleet, one of the most fearsome pirate organizations in the South China Sea. He wasn't the first pirate she had served, but he would be the last. Struck by her sharp wit and cunning intelligence, Zhang Yi proposed marriage. She accepted, but only with conditions. In a move almost unheard of for a woman in that era, she negotiated her position. She demanded joint control of the fleet, not just as a wife, but as a full partner. She would oversee political alliances, manage the spoils of their plunder, and have a say in every strategic decision. Zhang Yi agreed. Whether it was out of love or pure business sense, he recognized that she was a valuable asset. Their marriage in 1801 marked the beginning of one of the most successful pirate dynasties in history. Qing Shi quickly immersed herself in the complex world of pirate politics. She studied the hierarchies, the rivalries, and the unwritten rules that governed the pirate community. While Zhang Yi sailed the seas and conquered, she quietly built her own network, recruited allies, and learned how to rule from the shadows. But she wouldn't remain in the shadows for long. When Zhang Yi died suddenly in 1807, possibly in a typhoon, many believed his empire would crumble. Dozens of pirate captains were ready to seize the opportunity, expecting a power vacuum. What they encountered instead was a determined power grab. Qing Shi stepped forward to take command, not through brute force, but through careful strategy. She took over the Red Flag Fleet, strengthened existing alliances, and married Zhang Yi's adopted son and lieutenant, Cheng Pezai, ensuring both personal loyalty and military strength, from prostitute to pirate queen in less than a decade. And she was just getting started. When Qing Shi took control in 1807, she didn't just inherit a pirate fleet. After all, she had exposed their naval weakness, defied imperial authority, and walked away without facing any punishment for her crimes. Even in her undeniable success, she remained a constant source of embarrassment to the throne. Western historians fared no better for many centuries. Piracy has been romanticized primarily through a European lens, focusing on images of peg legs, rum, parrots, and buried treasure. Qing Shi simply didn't fit that romanticized image. She wasn't a swashbuckling adventurer. She was a shrewd and strategic leader. She didn't duel for glory. She negotiated for power. She wasn't killed by the state. She negotiated with it and ultimately won. And for many chroniclers of history, that was simply not exciting enough. It was, in a word, inconvenient. But in recent decades, her legend has begun to re-emerge from the shadows. Scholars, feminist historians, and pirate enthusiasts have begun to actively resurrect her memory, reclaiming her rightful place in the global story of maritime power and resistance. Documentaries, historical novels, and even video games have started to acknowledge the incredible life and accomplishments of the pirate queen of the South China Sea. And yet, so much of her life still remains shrouded in mystery. Her true birth name has been lost to history. Much of what we know about her comes only through the biased perspectives of her enemies, including Qing officials, foreign sailors, and later European observers. But even the limited information we have is more than enough to create the silhouette of a true titan. She wasn't just a woman who broke the mold. She was a woman who never cared that the mold even existed in the first place. She didn't need the world's permission to become powerful. She seized power, wielded it with remarkable precision, and vanished into history with more wealth, authority, and dignity than any pirate, male or female, before or since. At court, debates often ended with someone flipping a table or being challenged to a duel using breadsticks. He also developed the charming habit of streaking through the castle, sometimes mid-meeting. One chronicler even recorded Wenceslas delivering royal edicts completely naked except for a sword belt. His justification: clothes are for the timid. Hard to argue with that kind of logic when the guy with the crown also has a long sword and no pants. Romantically, he favored barmaids, laundresses, and occasionally noble wives, though he seemed more invested in their beer recommendations than their feelings. Affairs weren't scandalous at his court. They were practically job interviews. One noble accused him of seducing his sister. Wenceslas just shrugged and offered him a drink. Eventually, the Holy Roman Empire decided they'd had enough of his royal shenanigans and removed him as king of the Romans. A polite way of saying, "You're fired, but we're pretending it's political." Even his own brother called him useless, undressed, and usually unconscious. Still, Wenceslas somehow reigned in Bohemia for decades. His people tolerated him the way one tolerates a loud, embarrassing uncle at a wedding, with eye rolls, careful seating arrangements, and lots of alcohol. In the end, he left behind a shaky kingdom, a flooded wine cellar, and a royal legacy best summed up as he ruled like every day was his last hangover. Henry VIII of England is what happens when unchecked power meets unchecked hormones. He ruled from 1509 to 1547 and spent most of it either getting married, getting divorced, or getting mad at the Pope for not supporting his questionable dating decisions. You've heard the rhyme: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But that barely scratches the surface of Henry's royal rom-com turned horror series. Let's start with Catherine of Aragon, wife number 1. And yet, even with all this, Ferdinand was still popular. His people admired his strength. Nobles were afraid of him, and visiting enemies quickly lost their enthusiasm for rebellion after seeing the Black Room. He ruled for decades, died in his bed, and passed the kingdom on to his, shall we say, legitimate heirs. Ferdinand's legacy: a stable kingdom, a terrifying basement, and the firm understanding that some kings build alliances, while others collect warning signs in glass cases. The year was 1119. The dust from the First Crusade still clung to the broken stones of Jerusalem. Christian pilgrims were flocking to the Holy Land, believing the sacred city was now safe. But outside the city walls, it was chaos. Bandits roamed the roads. Muslim warbands attacked caravans, and travelers were either butchered or sold into slavery. The dream of Christian safety in the East was falling apart. That's when a knight named Hugues de Payens, along with 8 companions, made a vow not to a king, not to a lord, but to God. They promised to protect Christian pilgrims with their lives, not just as soldiers, but as monks. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. No wives, no gold, no land, just horses, swords, and faith. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. A bit of a mouthful, yes, but that last part was important because King Baldwin II gave them a place to stay on the Temple Mount, where the ruins of Solomon's temple stood. From this holy ground, they took their name, the Knights Templar. For 9 years, they remained a small group, unofficial, underfunded, and incredibly dedicated. They lived like beggars, borrowing armor, sharing horses, training like crazy. But they were disciplined, devout, dangerous, and their reputation began to spread. It wasn't long before their strange mix of monk and warrior caught the eye of one of the most influential people in Christendom, Bernard of Clairvaux. The magnificent cathedral became a public sanctuary, echoing with stirring sermons, uplifting songs, and the occasional scolding from the towering pulpit. It was a sacred place to personally witness divine miracles or to earnestly beg for one's own. Every single surface inside the cathedral told a compelling story. The intricate sculptures, the vibrant stained glass, even the carefully laid floor tiles. Notre Dame didn't just passively house the divine. It actively performed it. Faith was absolutely everywhere, artfully carved in stone, floating in fragrant incense, radiantly emanating from stained glass. By the late 13th century, the breathtaking interior was nearly complete. The very heart of the magnificent cathedral beat strong and true, but it still conspicuously lacked one essential thing: a crown to literally pierce the heavens above. And that's when they finally began building the elegant spire. By the end of the 1200s, Notre Dame already looked like a genuine miracle. Its soaring towers impressed all who beheld them. Its immense nave echoed with sacred chants, and its dazzling rose windows flooded the interior with divine light. But something about it still seemed noticeably unfinished. The cathedral undeniably had a recognizable face, a beating heart, and impressive wings, but no real crown, no vertical accent to purposefully lead the eye beyond the high roof line and directly into the infinite heavens above. That's when detailed plans finally began for the elegant spire. Unlike the massive twin towers, which were intentionally heavy and grounded, the spire would be deliberately elegant, an upward-pointing needle rising gracefully from the exact crossing of the transept right at the very center of the church's cruciform layout. Skillfully constructed from durable oak and meticulously clad in protective lead, the original spire was both a demanding technical challenge and a powerful spiritual statement. She inherited a vast floating kingdom, but instead of allowing it to descend into chaos after her husband's death, she tightened her control and made it even more powerful. Under her leadership, the Red Flag Fleet didn't just survive. It thrived and expanded. The South China Sea had always been plagued by pirates, but what Qing she commanded was unprecedented in scale. She oversaw an armada of over 300 ships, and within a single year, that number more than doubled to over 600. Some estimates suggest that she eventually commanded more than 1,800 vessels, with up to 70,000 men under her command, a force that was larger than the navies of several major European powers at the time. She achieved this through ruthless pragmatism and a deep understanding of pirate psychology. She maintained her power not just through the use of force, but by creating a system that bound her captains to her. She established a strict code of laws that governed every aspect of pirate life, including the distribution of loot, loyalty to the fleet, discipline among the ranks, and the punishments for infractions. Disobedience was met with swift and brutal consequences. Anyone caught stealing from the common treasury was immediately beheaded. If a pirate assaulted a female captive without permission, he would be executed. If a pirate deserted, his ears would be cut off, and he would be paraded before the entire fleet as a stark warning to others. But it wasn't just fear that kept her fleet in line. Qing she also offered protection, structure, and the promise of profit. Her code allowed pirates to keep a fair share of the loot they acquired, roughly 20%, while the remaining 80% went into a communal fund managed by her. This gave everyone a vested interest in the system and fostered loyalty through stability and shared rewards. Even defeated rivals and coastal villagers often chose to join her ranks rather than resist her, recognizing the advantages of being under her protection. She wasn't simply forgotten. She was actively erased from the dominant narrative. But legends, as always, have a way of finding their way back into the light. Qing she didn't wear a crown of gold or jewels. She didn't need to. Her authority didn't come from a throne or from royal blood. It came from command, from respect, from fear, and from the thousands of voices that echoed her orders across the waves of the South China Sea. In every meaningful sense of the word, she was a queen, a monarch who ruled over a vast kingdom without borders, flags, or fixed territory. Her domain was the South China Sea, and her reach stretched from the Gulf of Tonkin to the shores of Guangdong. She built something that no one before or since has ever been able to replicate. Her pirate confederation was not merely a criminal enterprise. It was a political entity highly organized and incredibly functional. She controlled vital trade routes, established comprehensive codes of law, negotiated treaties with other powers, and enforced order across a region that even the mighty Qing Empire struggled to effectively govern. Her ships weren't just scattered bands of raiders. They were highly disciplined fleets that could be deployed strategically. Her captains weren't freelancers operating independently. They were officers who followed her every command without question. Her people weren't just a collection of rogues and outcasts. They were citizens of a floating nation, bound together by loyalty and a shared code. And yet, what makes her legacy so truly unmatched is not just her astonishing rise to power, but her equally remarkable exit from it. Most pirate stories end in fire, sword fights, and the hangman's noose. Qing Shi's story ended in successful negotiation, comfortable retirement, and lasting wealth. She didn't go down with her ship, defiantly fighting to the bitter end. Instead, she stepped off it unscathed, unbowed, and still firmly in control of her considerable fortune. After 20 years of marriage, Henry decided God was mad at him for not having a male heir. Naturally, the solution wasn't introspection. It was annulment, excommunication, and the creation of an entirely new church. He invented Anglicanism just to date someone else. That's not devotion. That's pettiness with a cathedral. Enter Anne Boleyn, wife number 2. Henry wrote her love letters full of passion, obsession, and really bad poetry. She gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, who would later become one of England's greatest monarchs, but no sons. This led to her arrest for adultery, witchcraft, and possibly giving side-eye at court. She was beheaded. Henry moved on with all the emotional depth of a potato. Jane Seymour followed, producing a male heir, Edward, before tragically dying from childbirth complications. Henry mourned her deeply, by which we mean he waited a respectful 11 days before scoping out wife number 4. Next came Anne of Cleves, who Henry chose based on a flattering portrait. In person, he said she looked like a Flanders mare. That marriage lasted 6 months and ended in what we'd now call a no-fault divorce and a politely written Yelp review. Catherine Howard, wife number 5, was much younger and considerably less discreet. She was executed for adultery, though honestly, it's hard to blame her. Being married to Henry at that point meant dealing with gout, paranoia, and a man who could barely walk but still insisted he was a gift to women. Finally, Catherine Parr, wife number 6, who wisely outlived him by being literate, patient, and excellent at dodging accusations. By the time Henry died, he'd bankrupted England, eaten half its livestock, and turned the royal court into a soap opera where heads rolled more often than wedding bands. In short, Henry VIII loved hard, ruled harder, and left a trail of drama so legendary it's still being turned into musicals. Bernard wasn't just any abbot. He was a spiritual rock star. When he spoke, popes listened, and he saw something special in these men. At the Council of Troyes in 1129, he helped write the official rule of the Templars, a strict monastic code mixed with military goals. He praised them as the new knighthood, a holy elite who fought not for glory, but for God. With Bernard's blessing and the Pope's approval, the Knights Templar were no longer just a bunch of desperate misfits. They became a religious order with divine approval. Donations poured in. Young nobles left their comfortable lives to join their ranks. From the dust of Jerusalem, the Templars were rising, holy, hungry, and now unstoppable. But they had no idea that their greatest blessing, papal independence, would one day be the reason for their downfall. With papal recognition secured and their white cloaks stitched with blood-red crosses, the Knights Templar weren't just monks with swords anymore. They were the shock troops of Christendom. The Crusader states in the Levant, fragile Christian outposts surrounded by Islamic resistance, were always under threat, and the Templars were now the wall holding back the tide. Their code was harsh but simple. Never retreat unless outnumbered 3-1. No ransoms, no mercy, no fear. They trained every day, fought with incredible discipline, and believed that dying in battle was the greatest honor. While most knights fought for loot and glory, the Templars fought with a terrifying sense of righteousness. They were God's fury on horseback. During the Second Crusade, they proved their worth. While disorganized lords argued and failed to capture Damascus, the Templars kept their discipline and fought through enemy lines. In small fights and big battles, their attacks became legendary. It wasn't just their skill, it was their reputation. Muslim commanders started mentioning them first in battle reports. Those white-cloaked devils with the red cross. This wasn't just mere decoration. It was the emphatic exclamation point of Notre Dame, its most visible and enduring prayer. Its complex construction demanded the skills of master carpenters and experienced metalsmiths. Heavy oak beams were carefully hoisted into place by sheer human power, assisted by rudimentary winches, pulleys, and scaffolding. The entire structure had to be relatively light yet incredibly stable in order to withstand the fierce winds that constantly battered Paris from the swirling Seine River. When finally finished, the spire elegantly pierced the sky like a sword lifted in fervent devotion. And beneath it, even more intricate and detailed work was steadily unfolding. The grotesque gargoyles, those bizarre and undeniably haunting creatures, slowly emerged from the rough stone. They weren't just deliberately grotesque for the mere fun of it. Many actually served as functional waterspouts, diverting damaging rain away from the delicate masonry. Others were purely symbolic, serving as stern guardians meant to frighten away evil spirits or simply remind unrepentant sinners of what eternally awaited them. This final phase also included dozens of unique chimeras, skillfully carved statues of hybrid beasts perched precariously high above the bustling city of Paris, their eternally watchful eyes forever scanning the distant horizon. They were equal parts waking nightmare and genuine marvel, an integral part of the Gothic love affair with all things mysterious and deeply symbolic. Inside the hallowed walls, the chapels were finally completed. The ornate choir stalls were intricately carved, and the priceless relics were carefully enshrined. Notre Dame was now fully operational, both a highly efficient sacred machine and a prominent national stage. It had taken well over a century of dedicated work, tens of thousands of skilled workers, and the unwavering faith of an entire kingdom. She divided the massive fleet into 6 squadrons, each identified by its own distinctive color: red, black, white, blue, yellow, and green. However, all of these squadrons ultimately reported to her. Her closest ally and second in command, Chung Pitsai, led the Red Squadron, which served as her elite force. Under Qing Shi's leadership, piracy essentially became a government unto itself, complete with taxation, defense, and a clear hierarchy. She effectively controlled the sea lanes from Vietnam to Hong Kong, dominating trade, raiding imperial outposts, and even collecting tribute from coastal towns and villages. The Qing dynasty possessed a navy, but Qing Shi possessed an entire empire, and it was constantly growing in power and influence. Qing Shi didn't just rule through charisma or fear. She ruled with ironclad rules. While the popular image of pirates often involves chaos, drunken revelry, and lawlessness, her fleet functioned more like a disciplined corporation than a mere gang of outlaws. And at the heart of the structure was her meticulously crafted pirate code, a detailed system of laws that transformed potential mayhem into a highly organized operation. This code wasn't some romantic document passed around by candlelight. It was brutal, binding, and enforced without hesitation. Every captain and crew member knew the stakes involved. Violations meant humiliation at best and execution at worst. One of the most important rules governed the division of spoils. After each raid, all loot had to be presented to the fleet's central storehouse. The pirate responsible for acquiring the loot received a 20% share, while the remaining 80% went into the collective pool. That pool, which was controlled by Qing Shi and her officers, was used for fleet maintenance, pensions for widows and orphans, bribes to corrupt officials, and emergency funds to cover unforeseen expenses. Stealing from the collective wasn't just frowned upon. It was punishable by death. By the time she died in 1844, she had accomplished what no other pirate, no emperor, and no general had ever done before. She walked away from absolute power entirely by choice, and she did so while keeping her formidable reputation and her personal legend completely intact. Today, there are few monuments that bear her name. No grand palace, no imposing statue in the town square, but her presence still haunts the South China Sea like a storm cloud that never fully dissipated. It lingers in the hushed whispers of sailors, in the ink-stained pages of rebel women's diaries, and in the hearts of those who understand that true leadership is not about birthright or inherited privilege, but about unwavering will and a relentless pursuit of one's goals. Qing Shi was undeniable proof that true greatness doesn't ask for permission. That even in a world specifically designed to silence and subjugate women, one voice, sharp, strategic, and unyielding, can command an entire empire. She ruled without apology, she fought without hesitation, and she retired without ever admitting defeat. She was not merely a myth or a legend. She was a real woman who conquered the sea and walked away before it could ever claim her. Her sails may be long gone, but her shadow still stretches across the waves, a reminder that even the most powerful empires can be challenged and overcome. Francis I of France, ruling from 1515 to 1547, was the walking embodiment of the Renaissance. Cultured, charming, sophisticated, and utterly incapable of keeping his trousers buttoned. To his credit, he was a great patron of the arts. He invited Leonardo da Vinci to France, built magnificent palaces, and helped turn France into a cultural powerhouse. But while the painters were painting and the poets were poeting, Francis was busy seducing anything with a pulse and a title. His court was famous, or perhaps infamous, for its opulence but also for being a kind of state-funded dating app. He employed gentlewomen of the bedchamber, a term that should have meant ladies-in-waiting, but really meant romantic shortlist. Entire political alliances were derailed because Francis accidentally bedded the ambassador's wife. And this wasn't quiet, subtle adultery. Francis was loud about it. He once declared to foreign dignitaries that French kings were expected to be excellent lovers, which sounds noble until you realize it came from a man who treated treaties and mistresses with the same level of commitment, which is to say, temporary. His most famous affair was with Françoise de Foix, a noblewoman who became his official mistress. She was witty, educated, and likely the only woman who could roast him in public and get away with it. Eventually replaced, because, of course, she was Bai and Episilou de Hailey, a woman whose name sounds like a medieval inside joke and whose political influence was matched only by her ability to outlast the competition. Even his enemies couldn't help but notice. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V once described Francis as more dangerous in the bedroom than on the battlefield. He meant it as an insult. Francis probably took it as a compliment. And somehow, amid the affairs, banquets, and what can only be described as diplomatic flirting, Francis still managed to rule effectively. They didn't just fight, they built defenses. All over the Holy Land, the Templars built a network of castles and outposts, like Safed and the mighty fortress of Bagras. These weren't just pretty estates. Templar castles were military strongholds with thick walls, trap-filled gates, and water systems designed to survive year-long sieges. When armies ran away, the Templars stayed behind to buy time or die trying. But their loyalty wasn't to kings or emperors, only to the Pope, which made them unique. Someone rulers both admired and feared. A king couldn't command them. A baron couldn't bribe them. Only the Grand Master, chosen from within, could give the order to fight or stand down. They were independent in spirit, even as they bled for the cross. And they weren't just recruiting soldiers. They were creating a legend. Their ceremonies were secret, their rules strict, their discipline absolute. To many, they were holy. To others, ominous. And yet, their popularity only grew. They had gone from 9 dusty knights to an elite order spanning continents. But with fame came whispers, and with whispers came envy. The sword of God had become sharp, but one day, it would be pointed at them. They started with borrowed armor and a vow of poverty. But within a century, the Knights Templar weren't just warriors. They were the world's most trusted financial institution. They didn't plan to become bankers. War made them rich, faith made them trusted, and necessity made them smart. It started with donations. Nobles eager to support the Holy Land gave them land, gold, livestock, even entire villages. The Templars didn't just hoard it. They managed it carefully and strategically. They built commanderies all over Europe, agricultural estates run like efficient businesses. Everything was accounted for: grain, livestock, taxes, tithes. A monk in England could send money to support a battle in Jerusalem within weeks. That kind of reach was unheard of. Then came the banking system. By 1345, nearly 200 years after the very first stone was solemnly laid, the towering cathedral was officially considered complete. But complete was never actually the right word to accurately describe it. Notre Dame was never permanently frozen in time. It would be continually restored, creatively reinvented, and powerfully resurrected across the coming centuries. But by the 14th century, the imposing structure itself was finally done. The Gothic age had finally constructed its undisputed masterpiece. By the mid-14th century, Notre Dame de Paris was no longer just a mere cathedral. It was the cathedral, a towering symbol of Catholic dominance, undeniable royal authority, and unique national identity. For the next 4 centuries, it stood proudly not only as the very heart of Paris, but also as a grand stage upon which the greatest dramas of France would relentlessly unfold. Then there was the issue of discipline. Disobedience in battle was considered a very serious offense. Cowards who abandoned their squadron or disobeyed direct orders could be flogged, executed, or thrown overboard into the sea. Desertion, on the other hand, carried an immediate sentence of decapitation. The code even addressed interpersonal relationships. If a pirate kidnapped a woman, he was required to treat her with respect. Sexual assault was grounds for immediate execution by beheading. She wasn't interested in chaos. She was interested in control, and the code provided her with exactly that. It created a reliable system where pirates knew the rules, understood the consequences of their actions, and were guaranteed their fair share of the profits. This bound their loyalty not just to Qing Shi as a leader, but to the entire system she had created. Incredibly, she allowed prisoners and coastal civilians to join her forces. In exchange, they had to swear unwavering loyalty to her code. Many did. Some joined out of fear, while others joined out of admiration for her strength and intelligence. Some simply realized that under Qing Shi's rule, piracy was safer, more profitable, and, surprisingly, more fair than life under the corrupt and oppressive Qing authorities. Her laws extended beyond the decks of her ships. Coastal villages under her protection paid tribute to her in exchange for safety and autonomy. Those who resisted her authority were burned to the ground as a warning to others. Those who complied became an integral part of her ever-growing empire. She wasn't just a pirate. She was a sovereign ruler in her own right, and her code was the law of the land, or rather, the law of the sea. By 1808, Qing Shi's pirate empire was no longer just a maritime nuisance. It was a full-blown national threat. Her fleet dominated the South China Sea, disrupted vital trade routes, and raided coastal towns with impunity. Though his wars were expensive and his taste in women even more so, the man was nothing if not enthusiastic. His reign was a whirlwind of silk, scandal, and second-hand perfume. Francis I wasn't just a king. He was France's most seductive historical liability. And honestly, he wouldn't have it any other way. Alfonso XI of Castile ruled from 1311 to 1350, and he had one major hobby besides ruling a kingdom: ignoring his wife in the most public, extravagant way possible. His poor, politically strategic wife was Maria of Portugal. Noble, well-connected, and unfortunately not Leonor de Guzman, the woman Alfonso actually cared about. Leonor was a Castilian noblewoman with a sharp mind, 11 children, and enough influence to basically run the court herself. And unlike Maria, she didn't need a crown to feel important. She just needed Alfonso's complete and shameless obsession. Now, most kings had mistresses. Alfonso turned his into a shadow queen. He built Leonor palaces, gave her land, and took her everywhere. Meanwhile, Queen Maria was left sitting alone at royal events like an unwanted centerpiece, while Alfonso made googly eyes across the hall at his side piece, who wasn't even trying to be subtle about it. To make matters worse or better, depending on your tolerance for medieval soap operas, Leonor wasn't just a mistress. She was politically active, negotiating treaties, commanding respect, and producing heirs like it was her full-time job, which, let's be honest, it kind of was. Alfonso refused to even pretend Maria mattered. In fact, he only spent time with her once, and it was purely for diplomatic reasons. After that, he retreated to Leonor's estate like a man allergic to marital obligations. This didn't sit well with Maria's dad, who happened to be the King of Portugal. At one point, international relations got so tense over the whole situation that a war nearly broke out. A nobleman heading to the Holy Land no longer had to risk carrying a chest full of coins. He could deposit funds with the Templars in Paris, get a coded letter, and withdraw the same amount in Acre. It was one of the earliest forms of international banking. The Templars charged small fees, kept careful records, and never defaulted. They became the Swiss banks of the medieval world, centuries before Switzerland even existed. Their clients included kings, queens, bishops, and merchants. They protected the French crown jewels, managed papal finances, funded crusades, and ransomed prisoners. In some cases, they even lent money to the very monarchs who would later try to destroy them. The Templars didn't show off their wealth. They didn't wear silk or gold. Their churches were simple, their clothes plain. But under that humble exterior was an empire of ledgers, vaults, and armored wagons. An invisible hand that touched nearly every economy in Europe. And yet, they refused to call themselves bankers. They were monks. Everything they did, they said, was in service to God. But the more gold they moved, the more enemies they made. The church looked the other way. After all, the Templars answered only to the Pope. But kings got nervous. They owed the Templars fortunes and couldn't control them. What started as a mission to protect pilgrims had become something stranger. They were warriors with no battlefield, monks with no monastery, bankers with no kingdom. And as their coffers grew heavier, so did the weight of suspicion. Power without oversight, that's when kings start sharpening knives. For all their strength, the Templars were fighting a losing battle. The Crusader states, Outremer, were castles made of sand, constantly being hit by the waves of Islamic resurgence. And leading that wave was Saladin, the brilliant sultan of Egypt and Syria. Unlike the disorganized and often petty Crusader lords, Saladin was a unifying force. And he had one goal: to take back Jerusalem. The Qing dynasty, deeply embarrassed and increasingly overwhelmed, was forced to take decisive action. But they were woefully unprepared for the force they were about to confront. The Imperial Navy launched a major campaign to crush the pirates, sending numerous warships to hunt down Qing Shi's fleet and bring her to justice. What followed was not a series of swift victories for the empire, but a humiliating display of imperial incompetence. Time and again, the Navy was outmaneuvered, outgunned, and simply outclassed by Qing Shi's forces. She possessed an unparalleled knowledge of the local waters, using weather patterns, island cover, and shallow tides to trap heavier Qing ships and turn the battles to her advantage. Her sailors were able to fight in highly coordinated units, switch vessels mid-battle with ease, and lure unsuspecting enemies into expertly planned ambushes with terrifying precision. On more than one occasion, entire Qing squadrons were captured, their ships absorbed into the Red Flag fleet, and their morale completely shattered. The difference in morale between the two sides was staggering. While imperial officers were often corrupt, poorly paid, or simply cowardly, Qing Shi's men were well organized, fiercely loyal, bound by her strict code, and highly motivated by the promise of reward for victory. As the battles dragged on, the Qing dynasty's desperation became increasingly apparent. They appealed to European powers, particularly the Portuguese and the British, to assist them in their naval engagements against the pirates. These foreign navies possessed more advanced ships and superior firepower, but they lacked the local knowledge and unity of purpose that Qing Shi's armada possessed in abundance. Still, the pressure continued to mount. By 1809, a coalition of Qing, Portuguese, and Cantonese forces had surrounded parts of her fleet. Imagine your in-laws being so mad about your mistress that they consider military retaliation. But Alfonso didn't care. He continued parading Leonor around the court like a royal trophy, and probably would have kept it up forever if the Black Death hadn't killed him in 1350. That's right. It took a literal plague to end his affair. After Alfonso died, Queen Maria finally had her moment. She had Leonor imprisoned and executed in a move that historians call vengeful, and most of us would call extremely fair. Alfonso's reign may be remembered for military victories, but let's be real. His true legacy was being one of the most publicly whipped kings in medieval history. Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair, and no, not in the personality sense, ruled from 1285 to 1314. His nickname came from his good looks, which were unfortunately not matched by good behavior. Outwardly, Philip was pious, serious, and all about moral reform. Inwardly, he was running a kingdom like it was a very tense reality show, complete with betrayal, secret trials, and a healthy dose of double standards, especially in the bedroom department. His most infamous scandal was the Tour de Nesle affair, a medieval sex scandal so messy it could have been scripted by HBO. It all started when Philip's daughter Isabella, yes, the same one who would later overthrow Edward II of England, noticed that her sisters-in-law were being a little too friendly with some knights, suspiciously friendly, like matching gift exchange and secret tower rendezvous friendly. Isabella ratted out her sisters-in-law to Philip, who launched a royal investigation with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. 2 of the princesses, married to Philip's sons, were found guilty of adultery and publicly imprisoned for years, their heads shaved, their titles revoked, and their reputations completely destroyed. In 1187, that goal was reached at the Battle of Hattin. The Templars were there, fighting to the last man, but they were crushed, outmaneuvered, outnumbered, and surrounded in the scorching heat. The Christian army was destroyed. Saladin captured hundreds of knights. Most were ransomed, but when it came to the Templars, there was no mercy. He executed almost all of them. To Saladin, they were too dangerous to keep alive. The loss of Jerusalem wasn't just a military defeat. It was a spiritual crisis. The city they had sworn to protect was gone. The Holy Sepulchre was back in Muslim hands. And with it, the Templars' original purpose had started to disappear. Still, they regrouped. The Third Crusade brought reinforcements, including Richard the Lionheart, who respected and relied on the Templars in battle. But even he couldn't take back Jerusalem. Over the next century, the Crusader states shrank like dying embers. One by one, cities fell. Antioch, Tripoli, and finally Acre in 1291. The last Templar stronghold in the Holy Land was lost. They retreated to Cyprus, where they built new headquarters and tried to stay relevant. But something had changed. They were still warriors, but with no Holy Land to defend. What were they fighting for? Their castles stood empty. Their legends grew old. Their discipline, once their defining trait, began to fade. At the same time, rival orders like the Hospitallers gained ground. Accusations of pride, corruption, and arrogance followed the Templars across Europe. Some whispered that they had become too rich, too secretive. Others said they were hoarding relics, dangerous ones. The East had shaped them, forged them, and broken them. And now, without it, the Templars were adrift. They still had their wealth, their network, their aura of power, but they had lost what made them essential. A sword with no war, a brotherhood with no crusade. And in that void, powerful enemies were watching. Yet even then, she managed to fight them off, retreating strategically and launching daring counterattacks that stunned her enemies. She wasn't just surviving. She was actively humiliating the empire and its foreign allies. But the war was taking a heavy toll. The sustained conflict drained resources and exhausted her men. Even pirate empires can't endure endless war forever. And while she remained undefeated at sea, she understood something crucial about the nature of power. Sometimes, power isn't about winning every single fight. Sometimes, it's about knowing when to walk away with everything still intact. She had absolutely no intention of dying at sea or being dragged in chains to a Qing court. She had a different plan. A plan that would leave even her most bitter enemies stunned and speechless. The 2 knights involved were tortured, flayed, and executed in the public square, because nothing says moral leadership like turning a family affair into a medieval snuff film. Now, here's where things get interesting. While Philip was handing out brutal punishments like candy, rumors swirled that he himself kept a few mistresses tucked away in private rooms of the Louvre, no less. Some whispered that he maintained a secret group of young women who were available to entertain visiting dignitaries, for diplomacy, of course. But unlike his daughters-in-law, nobody ever questioned the king's private affairs. Because when you're the one writing the rules, it's amazing how sin becomes strategy. Philip also had a special knack for using religion when convenient. He went after the Knights Templar for supposed heresy, but everyone knew it was about their money. It was the medieval equivalent of arresting your banker and calling it divine justice. So yes, Philip may have looked like a model of piety and honor, but behind that sculpted jawline and royal glare was a man with a deep commitment to hypocrisy and a working knowledge of where all the castle's secret doors were. Sigismund of Luxembourg, King of Hungary, King of the Romans, and eventually Holy Roman Emperor, was the kind of man who collected crowns the way other men collected wine goblets, which he also collected enthusiastically. Reigning from the late 14th to mid-15th century, Sigismund was smart, multilingual, and politically savvy. He also had a personal life so scandalous it would make a tavern bard blush. To begin with, Sigismund was married to Queen Mary of Hungary, a powerful woman in her own right, but marriage to Sigismund was more of a polite formality. He preferred his relationships less lawful, more frequent, and ideally not followed by conversation. By the start of the 14th century, the Knights Templar were still rich, still feared, and still powerful. But for the first time in their history, they were also irrelevant. The Holy Land was lost. No more crusades were planned. They had become a military order with no war, a religious order with no clear mission, and a financial powerhouse that answered to no king, which made them a target. No one looked at them with more suspicion or greed than King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair. He wasn't called fair because he was deeply in debt, bankrupt from wars with England and Flanders. And the Templars? They were his creditors. He had borrowed huge amounts of money from them to fund his armies and keep his throne. But Philip didn't like being in debt, especially to men he couldn't control. Even worse, the Templars were politically independent. They answered only to the Pope, not to the crown. They owned land in France but paid no taxes to the king. They had their own fortresses, their own courts, their own armies. To Philip, they were a dangerous state within his state. Untouchable, immovable, and unbearably rich. So he started plotting. Philip's propaganda machine went to work. Rumors spread that the Templars worshipped idols, spat on the cross, and performed disgusting initiation rituals. No proof, just whispers. But in an age of superstition, whispers were enough. He leaned on his puppet pope, Clement V, pressuring him to investigate. Clement hesitated, but Philip wasn't waiting. In secret, Philip planned one of the most coordinated mass arrests in medieval history. He set a date, gathered his soldiers, and prepared his torturers. And on one cold Friday morning in October 1307, Friday the 13th, he struck. All across France, Templar knights were seized, questioned, imprisoned, and tortured. Confessions were forced. Some broke within hours, others held out until their bodies gave out. It was treason disguised as holy justice, and it worked. His romantic side projects included noblewomen, laundresses, and at least one Italian opera singer long before opera existed, which speaks to his innovative spirit. Court officials often lost track of his mistresses, not because there were so many, but because they changed so frequently. Some historians suggest they just started numbering them. At court, his mistresses had their own quarters, servants, and, in one case, a private chapel, which is either deeply romantic or just wildly inappropriate, depending on how you feel about praying next to someone's mistress. Sigismund also had a fondness for disguises, particularly dressing as a commoner and sneaking into towns. Sometimes it was for espionage, sometimes to flirt with local women under the guise of being a very tall merchant. Apparently, nobody found this suspicious, despite him being the only merchant with a full entourage of servants wearing royal crests. And yet, the man ruled for decades, launched crusades, hosted the Council of Constance, and reformed imperial politics, all while carrying on affairs that would make even Casanova tell him to slow down. Mate. One ambassador once wrote that Sigismund greets all women as equals, especially in private. Which, while vaguely progressive, also sounded suspiciously like an HR violation. But despite his extracurriculars, Sigismund remained immensely popular, mostly because he managed to appear regal in public while quietly running the most chaotic love life in Europe. He wasn't just an emperor. He was a one-man renaissance, equal parts strategist, statesman, and scandal. And somehow he always got away with it. The public, once loyal, began to turn against them. The Pope, pressured and humiliated, found himself trapped. The tide had turned, not in battle, but in politics, and the warrior monks, who once charged into enemy lines, now sat chained in dungeons, accused of sins that no sword could defend.